Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope that you're having a restful and relaxing Shabbat, and that again you've had time with your family and with and to spend time with God and in His Word and in worship. Um, so this is going to be our fourth Parashah teaching, which is entitled Vayera, which in the Hebrew translated to English means He appeared. And so this goes further into the life of Abraham, and it goes into the life of Sarah, um, and into several other well-known biblical characters. Again, please excuse my voice; might be a little raspy today. I've been dealing with illness the past couple of days. All right, so having said, let's go ahead and jump right into our teaching. So, so we start off in chapter 18, where God reiterates the promise of a son. Now, God's already promised Abraham a son before, and unfortunately, Abraham and Sarah took into their own hands to go ahead and try to do things in their own logic when God didn't appear to be fulfilling the promise. Now, whether that was because of like a lack of faith or because of lack of understanding or whatever it happened to be, that is what happened. So, in chapter 18, it says that God appeared to them. Well, that's an interesting phrase right out of the gate. God appeared. Okay, well, it gets even more strange because we think about that. No man can see God and live, right? Well, God appeared. Well, which is it? If if God appeared, that means that everybody around should have been dead, right? Because no man can see God and live. Yet God appears, and they are all fine. It also says that there was three men to appear to him, to Abraham, which means that one of them was God. Well, that's even more strange, right? Because if God is God and men are imperfect, then wouldn't that be basically degrading himself for God to appear as a man, especially he who is without form, which is why we're told not to make idols God is because God does not take the God is not like an animal or some lower being. But at the same time, here it says that he appeared as a man. Now, this is interesting because if you look throughout the rest of the Tanakh and the Torah specifically, it talks about the angel of Adonai speaking as God in the first person. You see it in Genesis 16, which is back a couple chapters. We see it again in Exodus 3. We see it in Numbers 22. We also see it here, where you have you also see it later in the later on in Genesis as well. So it's kind of interesting. There's something really going on here because, again, if no man may see God and live, yet God is here as a man with these two angels, we find out later, who are, and in the scripture, the Hebrew actually uses the word for men. It's not some word that's actually used as a metaphor or whatever way you want to look at it, or analogy or anything of that nature. It's actually used as it exactly what it is, which is anashim. Okay, so we know there that they literally appeared as men. So there is something really going on here, and it's something that we need to pay close attention to because it's very, very important to what happens later and throughout the Bible. All right, so when these men arrive, Abraham shows really awesome hospitality. I mean, that the type of hospitality he shows is absolutely incredible. he just by looking at the verbiage of how this is described, he is doing everything he can to make sure he's able to serve these men. Um, it's almost like he absolutely has to. It's an absolute like a strong urge that he must serve and cater to these men. Um, and he didn't waste time either. I mean, he went ahead and as soon as they agreed, he ran back to Sarah and said, "Go ahead and get bread ready, get this all the food ready, get everything ready." And they didn't waste any time in getting everything prepared to serve their guests. So um, Abraham was obviously a huge proponent to hospitality. And yes, back in that day, hospitality was a very large thing. It was a thing of honor. Whereas if you weren't hospitable to people like that, it was kind of like you were insulting them and insulting yourself, like you were looking at yourself as a bad host, as a bad human being. And so, but you can see his heart in it, where he was really wanting to serve these people. It wasn't begrudgingly. It wasn't, oh, I have to do this. But no, he did it because he really wanted to. And that's the kind of heart that God's looking for, a cheerful giver. Okay. Now, when all the meals made and served and everything, it insinuates that God eats. Now, it doesn't say that flat out in the text, but why else would God have actually had him, go through and make all that food if he wasn't going to actually sit there and eat it? I mean, it doesn't make much sense. I mean, I guess he could have, just sat there and said, "Hey, I let you do this, but no, I don't really want anything." Well, that would have also been insulting as well, because to have all that food served and then not to eat what your host puts before you is insulting. And so that's another clue, at least to me, that God did actually eat the food that was put before him. He actually shared a meal with Abraham. Okay, and honesty. I mean, we do that here, right? When we get together, we want to get together for to meet with family or with friends. It's usually centered around some kind of meal. It's human nature that or it's really relationship based, where we sit there and we relate to each other over a meal. And so God does, he went ahead and eats a meal with Abraham and relates to him over a meal, something that culture and still today still dictates. Okay, so verses 10 through 15, we see that um, he was actually one of the men there. Actually, it makes it quite clear that God actually was one of the men that showed up there. If there was any doubts before, verses 10 through 15 make that quite clear. Um, Now, God went ahead and again he reiterates the promise he made that he would have a son from his own body, and also thou Sarah. And of course, Abraham laughs, and so does Sarah. But it seems they laugh for different reasons. Abraham laughed. I think it was kind of incredulous. He couldn't understand how God could do something like that. When Sarah laughed, it seemed more of a um, and this is going to sound kind of like a "you're right," or maybe something of that nature. And I say that because when you look later how God replies, it kind of insinuates that Sarah kind of doubted what God was going to do, and it kind of goes back to um, her doubting originally when she came up with the plan for Abraham to get with Hagar and by that method give Abraham a child um, as an heir. Um, Now, the most miraculous part of this, and I don't think people understand this, so it wasn't just that Sarah was barren and just couldn't have a child. I mean, there was that as well. But now in this part, when you read in the scripture, it actually talks about that she was past the time even to have a child. So it wasn't a thing that she was just barren. She was no longer going through the physical processes that would enable her to even have a child. And so that made Isaac's or Yitzhak's um, birth even more miraculous, because she was able to have a child after um, the physical process in her body to do so had long stopped happening. Okay. Okay, so we talked about just a minute ago a kind of situation that Sarah did doubt, um, which then prompts God's question in verse 14, which he said, "Is anything too difficult for me?" And the only reason he would say something like that is if Sarah was doubting. Okay. Now, this isn't to denigrate or speak against or negatively against Sarah. It's to show that there has been doubt that Sarah's been every single one of these biblical characters is not perfect. They all have their own character flaws. Part of Sarah's character flaw was a lack of faith. Okay, and we'll get to see another one of Abraham's here in a little bit when we go over another part of this parashah. But I say that because we need to realize that these people, they were not superhumans. They were not people who were impervious to sin. They were not impervious to character flaws. They're human beings just like we are. They made mistakes. They had good points, high points, and low points. Um, the difference was with Abraham, and they talked about last parashah, was that he basically clung to God. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a friend of God. This is what made him stand out among everybody else. All right, in the last parashah, we see that God instructs Abraham to name his son Yitzchak, which means laughter. And there's definitely a lot of laughter going on again at this point for different reasons. Okay, so you can see where this name that God commanded Abraham to give his son is very central to a lot of different aspects revolving around um, the promise and the birth of the son. Now, at this point, you have to assume that Abraham and Sarah both understood that one of the men was God among them. Okay, this also explains Sarah's fear um, when she denied that she laughed. Why would she have had reason to fear? Um, and the men wouldn't have, and at that point, with this man making the same promise that God did, back in the last parashah, we know that this man is God. Abraham and Sarah has to know when God makes his promise again to them that this man is actually God. Um, and so it explains again Sarah's fear um, in trying to attempt to deny that she doubted God. Okay. All right. So after the meal, um, the men get up and they start to walk over towards Saddam. This kind of leads towards what their mission was. So even though they stopped and ate with Avraham, Avraham was kind of like a pit stop in a way towards Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so as any good host would, Avraham basically, for all intents and purposes, walks the men to the door. He walks them to go ahead and leave, and kind of walks with them, saying their goodbyes and wishing them well, and whatever else happens when have you know uh, people your guests leaving you. Um, so we start to actually get a sense that there's some divine purpose here. Okay, um, it Abraham or God does visit Abraham to reiterate his promise. He does, um, and then he does go on to Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's like a twofold reason why God is here. But now we're going to go ahead and bring a third reason into this. Okay, so in verse 17, and we'll go into that third reason in just a minute. Verse 17, I just want to point out this is one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible. Um, and the reason why is because it talks about God saying, should I not reveal what I'm going to do to Abraham, seeing what I'm going to do with him? And so you can sense that friendship here, like a man talking with his friend. And it's kind of the picture I get here is that God is speaking with Abraham like a friend. Um, and so it's a very interesting relationship dynamic because Abraham is reverent. He knows who he's in the presence of, but at the same time, God treats him as a friend. And so it's a really beautiful verse. It really is. Um, okay, so again, we notice that God's comment that he had made himself known to Abraham. Um, God is the one who chooses to reveal himself to us initially. So when we, um, whenever initiate a relationship with has been initiated, God is the one who initiates that. It's not us. We don't ever find him; he finds us. Um, and that's how it's been over the entirety of humanity's relationship with God. He has always had to come find us. If you look back in the Garden of Eden, he had to come find us, and he's been trying. He's had to come find us ever since. And so God is the one who is initially causing that relationship to come about, and then we just are required to respond positively. Um, so now, a curious phrase here. God promises that in Abraham all the nations will be blessed. That creates preposition there, in. Well, why is in used? Why is it not because of? Because of you, all the nations will be blessed. Or as a result of your obedience, all the nations will be blessed. No, in him, it says, in Abraham, all the nations will be blessed. So there is a specific thing, for lack of a better term, that's going to come forth from Abraham that is going to cause all the nations to be blessed. God also talks about that um, Abraham, part of the reason of the covenant and God's promises is also to cause Abraham to teach his children and all his family and all those that proceed from him to walk in the way of Adonai, okay, and which God uh, terms as righteousness and justice, at least in the English translation. However, in the Hebrew, the word for righteousness is tzedakah, which is not just righteousness. It's actually more of an active righteousness. It carries kind of an action behind it. So it's not just a state um, of being. It is actually a state of living. so so righteousness has to be performed where there's no evidence. So that's the kind of righteousness God wants from us. It's righteousness being lived out, where there's evidence of our righteousness. Now, does not mean we do things before men to get glory. That does not mean that we could ever earn our way into favor with God, or at least earn our way into eternal life. But what it does mean is that, if we don't we don't act righteously, then there's no fruit to prove that we're righteous. Okay? The other word where it's translated as justice in the English translation is a word called mishpat. And what that really comes out to in the Hebrew is to mean just decisions. Okay? So we are to make decisions that are just. Okay? It's not just about giving justice to people, or however we might try to read into that. It's really about acting righteous and making right decisions. Okay? So the point of the covenant is to create a people who will follow God and ultimately a Messiah to come forth that will restore what God originally intended in God Eden. Remember, at this point, God is working through humanity to restore humanity to its state pre-fall. Okay? Along the way, God is using humanity, whoever will, specifically Abraham here, to go ahead and try to repair this world. And that is our job as believers, is to continually work alongside with God as he works through us to continue to try to repair this world until this age is over and God ultimately repairs it. Now you notice that also in here, in what God talks about the promise, he says, so that I can do all that I promised Abraham. Okay? Well, that what that means is that the covenant blessings, what God promises, are contingent on obedience. Now, excuse me. Now, what that means is that if we don't, if we don't, if we're not obedient, then the curses of that covenant ensue. Yeah, remember that in a covenant there were both there were benefits and then there were penalties. If the covenant was abided by, the benefits were continuing to flow. If it was not abided by, then the penalties of the covenant kicked in. Okay, and so and so God's covenants do not change. So even though, you know, if Abraham had slipped and he had kind of stumbled and things got kicked down the road or whatever, that does not mean God's covenant was canceled. God does not cancel his covenants. What it means is that the penalties of that covenant would kick in until the the other member, the other participant of the covenant came into obedience to where the blessings would actually start, the benefits of the covenant would actually start flowing again. Okay, so one thing I noticed here when they were looking at talking about Sodom and Gomorrah is God pointing out just how bad Sodom was. Now, if you if you think about it, God sees all sin as bad. It doesn't matter how big or little, sin is sin, sin is bad, sin is destructive. But he made a point here, pointing out just how bad Sodom's sin was. So it had to be really bad for God to essentially come down and point out how bad it was. Um, Now, their sin was at full. It was there. God's situation. You think back to where the time when God talked to Abraham about the Amorites. Whenever he told Abraham in a vision about what was going to happen to his descendants, he talked about that at the time the Amorites, the iniquity or the sin of the Amorites was not full yet. So apparently, for cities and for nations, they had to, before God took action, their sinfulness had to reach a certain point. Okay, and it's the same thing here with Sodom and Gomorrah. That their sin had reached a certain point, was full, and now that God was going to take action. Now, God knew how bad it was in the seas. He already knew what was going on. His conversation with Abraham was to test him. Um, God already knew what he was going to do. It was already decided. God knows everything before it happens. So this was not a surprise to him. He did not have to come down and verify anything because he already knew. The whole point of the narrative here is to test Abraham, and as you can see in the next several verses, you'll see how this plays out. So when Abraham hears about what God is going to do, his immediate concern is for those who are righteous not to be swept away with the wicked. Okay? And he extols God's virtue, saying, God, please don't do this. You are righteous. You are the judge of the earth. You should not allow the righteous to be swept away with the wicked. And I probably guarantee he's probably at the same time thinking about Lot, because he knows where Lot went to live. Okay, so his mind was on Lot. Yes, there was an ulterior motive. I'm not going to deny that. He was worried about Lot. But at the same time, he was also worried about those who were righteous, who were going to get destroyed along with the wicked. Now, Abraham is a little gutsy here. So you have the God of the whole universe right there with you. Okay? Now, first of all, you haven't died, so that's a miracle right there. Second, God has appeared in the form of a man, and to actually sit and to relate and to talk with Abraham. Okay, and so Abraham takes the opportunity to go ahead and intercede for these cities, for these people, and asks that God would not destroy it. First, it was over 50 people, then over 40, and he works his way down all the way until he gets to 10. If God's like, fine, if there's 10 righteous in this, I can find 10 righteous in those 5 cities. Okay, there are 5 cities here. It talks about just Sodom and Gomorrah. A lot of times it talks about Saddam, but Saddam represented all 5 cities. Okay, and so um, with Saddam, um, uh, it would have he would have to find 10 righteous in the entirety of those 5 cities. Okay, and so again, God already knew what he was going to do. He had already planned. Abraham did not negotiate God down to anything. God had already had a plan what he was going to do. Okay, um, it was a test for Abraham. It was not. It was not going to change what God was going to do. Okay, do not and cannot change God's mind. Okay, He knows everything before it's going to happen. He knows how it's going to happen. He lets things play out. He allows things to play out, but He already knows what's going to happen. All right, and so again, not only is Abraham set an example for us in how to be hospitable to people, but also an example of how it means to intercede for other people. Okay, he did everything he could to intercede to help these cities survive, and by proxy, Lot as well. All right, so now we're in chapter 19. We're actually go into the narrative that talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. So unfortunately, not even 10 righteous could be found in all the 5 cities. There must have been probably a couple 100,000 people in those cities, give or take. And so trying to find just 10, I mean, and still not being able to find just 10, all those people, was very indicting, very damning of those cities. So the 2 angels that accompanied God are now back in the picture again. And they appear in the plaza kind of area of Saddam, um, and um, and their job has already been to be sent there to destroy Sodom. All right, so why are they sitting out here in the middle of the square? I mean, why don't they just do it right then and there? The answer is because of Lot. Okay, Lot and his family are there, and because of Abraham, um, God is going to go ahead and rescue Lot from the cities before he destroys them. Okay? And so it seems Abraham's commitment to service and the culture as well has rubbed off on Lot. Lot is urging them, begging them to come in and have a meal with him, to stay the night, and then go ahead and be on their way in the morning. Okay? So at first, Lot does not recognize them as angels. They are seen as men. Okay? Um, And so you can tell Lot knew how bad things got after dark because of how much Lot urged them to stay inside and not stay out in the plaza. So eventually, the angels, agreed, and they went ahead and went inside. So they're getting ready to turn in for the night, and all of a sudden, all of the people from the city, from the children all the way up to the very elderly, all of a sudden appear outside of Lot's house. Okay, now you can imagine, you know, um, Lot sitting there with his family and these 2 guests, and this huge mob of thousands and thousands of people show up outside of his house. Um, and so, and the whole purpose of these people is to sexually abuse these 2 angels, is to be of the utmost depravity. Okay, and so Lot attempts to intercede in a way for the angels with the people of the city. He's trying to get them to leave him alone. That's part of the hospitality thing. Is not let anything happen to the guests under your roof. But Lot does not have the same righteous sense of hospitality that Abraham did, because he goes way too far. He actually goes to offer his daughters um, instead, so that these two guests won't be abused. And that's not something Abraham would have done. And so this sense of his hospitality is going way beyond what it should have. It actually reflects the culture's sense of hospitality. It's a kind of a different thing here. So the hospitality that Abraham displayed was godly, God-centered hospitality, whereas the hospitality that Lot is offering here is culture's spin on hospitality. Okay, so when Lot tries to do this, um, the people of the city get very angry, um, basically telling him that he has no right to say anything because he's just there, hasn't lived there very long. He was a sojourner that showed up. But they also say there's a key phrase here that he dares to judge them. Okay, now that's a very common thing to hear nowadays. Everybody, oh, don't judge me. Dare to judge. Now, um, if we don't make judgments about things, then no decisions will be made. Okay. Now, the word for judge used here is actually related to the word mishpat, which also means, um, again, we saw means just decisions. Okay. So Lot is the people of Sodom, without knowing or not, basically accuse or threaten Lot because he's daring to make a just decision here. Okay, um, he's he's not only justly deciding to protect his guests, he's also justly deciding to call what they're doing what it is. Um, and so, just like people nowadays, no one likes to be told um, what they're doing is wrong. No one wants to be challenged. No one likes to have the word of God spoken to them because it reproves them of what they're doing. And so the same attitude that was prevalent in this narrative right here is the same attitude prevalent nowadays. It's exactly the same. All right, so the angels are once again described as men, and I keep pointing this out because we get stuck in our heads that um, that God and the hosts of heaven would not degrade themselves to appear as men, or to so. But this is exactly what's happening. Both God and His angels both appear as men. Okay, and so the angel is probably aware that the people are going to successfully force their way inside and hurt Lot and his family, strike the people blind, and then the doors, and then they can't find the door to actually tear it down and get inside. Now, so God was not; these angels were sent here to destroy the city, right? So the city was not going to be saved. So He would not save the city because of so few righteous, but He was going to deliver the righteous out of the city, and also for the sake of Abraham. So Lot and his family were the only ones considered righteous. Okay, and if you think about it, there was only four of them. There was Lot, his wife, and his two daughters. Okay, and so God only found four. He didn't even find five. He found four. Okay. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but once a place of sin is full, whether that be a city or a nation or whatever it happens to be, only their repentance will save it. It will not be saved from the presence of a few righteous people. So if you look at Nineveh, Nineveh was an example of their city was ready to be destroyed by God because they were in the same boat as Sodom and Gomorrah currently are in this Parashah. But they repented, and that is what saved them, not the presence of a few righteous people. Okay, it always goes back to repentance. Um, So Lot goes to grab everyone out. Hey, get up, come on, we got to go. The whole place is about to be destroyed. But instead of going with them, they thought he was joking and ignoring. So we now come to the morning time. It's right before the sun comes up, as we'll see, because later on it talks about the angels taking them out of the city as the sun was coming up. Um, so it's before the sun comes up. It's still morning, but right before the sun comes up. Um, I'm sure that these angels probably came in the evening, maybe slash night, um, the day before. If you're talking about our days, um, so the non-Hebrew days, um, and so uh, there's been a lot of time that's probably passed between Lot initially trying to get them up and get them going, and and when these angels come back by. So the angels come back by, and they're trying to rush him, and they're saying, "What are you doing? Come on, we're going to destroy this place. Let's go, let's go." Um, and instead of just going with them, he hesitates. Um, and so not only are his wife and children not believing him to leave, now he is hesitating to go. Now, this could have been for several reasons. It could have been weakness on his part. Maybe he also had a bit of a attachment to his stuff there and didn't want to leave. Um, which I mean, it really makes you question if you know that this city's going to be destroyed, regardless of what you have there. You'd think you'd want to save your own skin, but it doesn't seem like Lot's thinking about that at this point. Um, Even though, and what's interesting is that at this point, they had to have known that both these men were angels. And so what they were saying was legit. This city was going to be destroyed. And so it's just confusing um, why Lot would sit there and not really force the issue and make them get up and leave, um, or even hesitate when the angels try to come rush him. If he knows these two men are actually angels, are legit, they're legitimately going to destroy the city. It just goes to say a lot about Lot's mindset at that time. Um, so it was only that God's compassion saved Lot. It was because of Abraham and God's compassion on Lot that God saved him. Otherwise, the angels probably would have just stopped trying to get him to leave. He was hesitant. He wasn't really taking it seriously. Otherwise, he would have forced the issue. And so, unless God told the angels, "Hey, you need to get him out of there," they probably would have stopped trying. Um, So Lot begs to go to a small city. Now, it could be a lack of faith. It could be legitimate. It could be legitimate that, hey, I don't think I'm going to make it that far. Even though, by the angels telling them to run, not look back, it kind of implies that God's going to keep them safe. Lot doesn't look at it that way. That could be indicative of a lack of faith. He could just not trust he was going to make it to a small city or out of there far enough away in time. Um, and that God was not going to protect him. Um, so Lot begs to go to a small city, and this city is spared out of 5. This one city is spared. Now, why Lot makes a point of saying, "Hey, it's just a small city. Look at it; it's really small." It's almost like he's trying to qualify why this city should be saved and him being able to go flee to it. So maybe he was thinking that perhaps because of how small Zoar was that it wasn't going to make much of a big impact with their wickedness because of how small they were. I don't know, but it's kind of interesting how Lot points out how small the city is. All right, so continue on the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative. The angels commanded Lot and his family to go straight to Zoar and not to look back. So I mean, it's almost like you know, if you're escaping some kind of absolute tragedy, and you're running for your life. You're running your heart out, and you're not looking back at all. I mean, you're just running, not looking back, just running as hard and as fast as you can to get away from that place. This is what the angels wanted Lot and his family to do: to run for their lives, to not look back, and just to keep on going. um, until they got to Zoar. Now, this is when a very well-known part of the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative takes place. So Lot's wife looks back. Okay. Now, it wasn't solely as an issue that she disobeyed by looking back, like doing looking back physically. It wasn't just a physical act. Okay. Yes, that was part of it. She disobeyed what the angels told. She looked back. Okay, even they told him not to. But there was also another part of it. Okay, so she looked back as almost if longing for the cities. Like she's looking back at what she's leaving. She's looking back at what's about to be lost or destroyed. And so she's apparently, and remember, Lot was wealthy. This is why him and Abraham had to split ways because both of them owned so much stuff that they couldn't cohabit with each other. And um, so Lot was very wealthy, and so they probably had a very nice lifestyle in Sodom. Okay, and so so Lot's wife is looking back and it's looking at all they're about to lose because they're escaping by the skin of their teeth, and they got the clothes on their back. I don't know if they maybe grabbed some stuff to take with them. I'm not sure. They probably weren't able to take any animals or anything of that nature because they were running. So it was literally just them and whatever they could carry with them. And so she is turned into a pillar of salt. Um, and she was judged for longing for a place that is wicked and where God's laws were ignored. Um, she wanted to go back and live that lifestyle regardless of what was happening in that city and how God's laws were being flaunted. Okay? And so, along with the physical act, which looking back, this is why um, what happened to Lot's wife happens. Now, as you can see, because you turn into a pillar of salt, um, the what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah was not entirely physical. There was the physical aspect of fire and brimstone falling upon Sodom and Gomorrah, but it was also a spiritual thing because um, if it was purely a physical incident, then Lot and his wives, Lot and his daughters also went in proximity close enough to also then turn into a pillar of salt. And so there is definitely a supernatural component to what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. And you can see by Lot's wife's behavior um, that it seems that the influence of Sodom and Gomorrah already started to affect them. It already seemed like they're starting to compromise. They're not thinking. They're no longer around the influence of Abraham and his righteousness. Now they're in the midst of a cities that are extremely, utterly wicked. Okay, and so as the old saying goes, bad company corrupts good character. So they've been around there long enough to where the behaviors of the Sodomites and has started to cause them to actually compromise themselves. So at the end, Abraham, he comes forward, looks out towards the valley, and he sees smoke rising from it like a cauldron. He knows that God has went ahead and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and all the cities. They're gone. Um, and so, he must have felt extreme sadness over that. He pleaded with God for that not to happen. But he trusted God. He knows that if it was destroyed, he must not have been able to find 10. And of course, he's worried about Lot as well. He was worried about Lot. Um, but, it must have been really hard for him to see that happen. He realized that hundreds of thousands of people, it wasn't like, so if you think back to when Abraham was fighting the four kings who had come from the east, from Elam, which is the Iran area around the Persian Gulf, when they had come to force Sodom and those cities to become subservient to them again. And so Abraham fought against those four kings, not murder, but killed all of the army, killed down to the very last man, chased them all up to Damascus to do so. And Abraham didn't feel bad about that because he was doing what was right. Here, and it was what was right was done also. God did what was right. Don't get me wrong, but it's a little bit different here because now Abraham's seeing that it wasn't just soldiers that had died here. It was men, women, children, young and old. It was the whole entire spectrum of humanity that died in these cities. And so that it's probably part of what Abraham was thinking about was it wasn't just some soldiers that were armies that were wiped out. It was entire cities. Now Abraham had to have had know, even before God came to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, how bad these cities were, because he would refuse to accept any reward from the king of Sodom. Remember back in the last Parashah. So he had an idea of how bad things were. Um, he may not have had the full idea of just how bad it actually was. Um, so All right, so this is a picture of what is believed to be Lot's wife as a pillar of salt. Now, you'll say, well, okay, well, where's the salt? That's brown, it's not white. Well, I mean, how many thousands of years has it been? Dust and all kind of things put together. The salt has probably turned into rock, like and then like again, like I said, it's been you know, um, you know, hit with dust storms and all kind of things like that, and so now it's brown. But um, if you kind of look towards the top um, portion, if you see there's like the very 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 top, so the very top right here. I don't know if you see my cursor or not, but the top right here, that looks like maybe a part of her hair or a hairdo or maybe a top piece. This looks like the back of her head and her hair. And then it looks like her back right here, and then this looks like maybe her clothes or her dress kind of flowing off. Maybe a leg extended backwards as she turned. Um, but this is, and then it looks like maybe there's an arm right here. So, you know, it definitely looks like Lot's wife. And you can actually go over to Israel and you can actually visit this. Also, you can also go down into the Dead Sea area, and you can see there are still sulfur and salt balls around there. You can see a lot of the evidence still today of how Sodom and Gomorrah was basically melted down to nothing. One more thing, Sodom and Gomorrah also paints a picture of what God's going to do at the end of the age. That those things that offend, those things that are not of Him, are going to be burned up and melted the same way Sodom and Gomorrah was, and totally, utterly destroyed. Um, and I'm going to add one more point here. So if you read further in the Torah, um, there were things that could be cleansed with water, and there were things that could be cleansed only by fire. Fire was meant to cleanse the things the strongest of uncleanness. Okay, and um, so fire here was used. It wasn't just water. It wasn't like the flood or whatever, and things were washed. It was burned up. And that's the extent God went to get rid of the uncleanness that was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, so we get into the account of Lot fathering Moab and Ammon. So, so Lot and his daughters are in Zoar. So his wife's gone; she's a pillar of salt. Um, Everything they knew in that valley is gone. Um, and they have no idea. They may not have any idea of what's happening outside of their valley. Um, they may think it's the end of the world, that everybody else is gone too. I mean, there could be all kinds of things going through their head. They're traumatized. It's been a really, really rough night and day, and maybe days. I mean, we don't know how long it's been since then. Um, Regardless, they don't stay in Zoar very long. Lot decides to get out of there. Maybe he's afraid God's going to destroy it anyways. After all he's seen, I mean, he's ready just to get out of there, and he goes to live up in the mountains. Okay, um, and so whatever was going through Lot's daughters' minds, they decide they still want children for themselves, and they don't want Lot to be descendantless. They want him to have descendants. And so they went ahead and make a plan for each of them to sleep with their father and then have kids based on that way. Now, regardless of what was going through their mind, of what the world was like or whatever, there was still no excuse for basically doing incest. There was no excuse for it at all. Okay? And they must have known that it was not right, because they actually named their two children, and each name insinuates that they actually did come from their mother's father. Okay, and so there was it's almost like they weren't ashamed to name them that. Now I don't know if maybe they were just trying to honor their father that way, but it could also be looked as a way of them basically flaunting it. Um, And so it came to mind that maybe there was more evidence of how Sodom and Gomorrah had really influenced and had started to cause um, Lot and his family to compromise on their morals. All right, that is the last we actually hear of Lot, and we actually hear about Moab and Ammon later in the Torah and throughout the Tanakh, but we don't hear about Lot again. So now we come back in chapter 20. We start talking about Abraham and Sarah again. So Abraham is now living around the area of the Philistines, which would have been the southwest part of, well, not southwest. It would have been probably somewhere. Well, it would have been southwest at this point. Eventually, the Philistines had a large portion of the Mediterranean coast under their control. Um, but um, but at this point, it was probably just the southwest corner of Israel, right around the the very southern part of the Mediterranean coast. In any event, so Abraham was living around in the Philistines, the land of the Philistines, and it actually was the land of the Philistines right now. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Um, so when he's there, he's around the people, and you see later he assumes these people have no morals, that they'll just do whatever. And maybe they've proven that, maybe it was for good reason that he thought that. But regardless, he uses the same tactic he did before, telling Sarah to go ahead and to tell them that she is his sister. Now later on, Abraham says, "Hey, she really is my sister because she is my father's daughter, only not from the same mother." Um, but even still, this was again another flawed decision on his part, and again it shows again that Abraham had character flaws, and some of them were persistent, like this one. It had to do with fear. It's amazing how fear works, because we as humans, we can be afraid of one thing and then be fearless in other situations. It's just interesting how our minds work like that. Um, and so God was working on Abraham, just like He works on all of us. Okay, so this happens as Pharaoh did. Abimelech takes his wife and plans to marry her, sleep with her, or whatever. Um, and then God warns him in a dream that, hey, you're all going to die. You're going to be punished if you touch her. And Abimelech said, whoa, you know, I was told that she is his sister. Basically, hey, I didn't know any of this. And so God basically said, I know that. And that's why I prevented you from doing this. So God prevented a tragedy from happening. He actually um, prevented Abimelech from actually having his entire nation destroyed because of lack of knowledge. Now, here's the thing, and this is what sin is like. Even though you may sin and it's out of ignorance, it's still sin. I'm gonna say it again. Even though you sin out of ignorance, it's still sin. So had Abimelech done that, um, he would have reaped the same consequences regardless of whether it was done in ignorance or not. Now, um, God does warn him, hey, if you don't give her back, this is definitely going to happen. But I prevented it from happening, to give you a chance to do the right thing, basically. Okay, so Abimelech was given the chance to do the right thing, to return Abraham's wife, and God uses instance to again try to shape the character of Abraham. Okay, so apparently during this dream that he had, Abimelech knew who God was. Now, these are polytheistic, like almost everybody else around except for Abraham was. They were polytheistic, but they still had knowledge of the God of Abraham. He had to have. He acknowledged him as such um, during this narrative. And so, again, God, just like he used Pharaoh, God's using Abimelech here to chastise Abraham for his behavior. Abraham's behavior almost got a whole nation destroyed. Um, and so Abraham uses the same excuse. Well, I knew you guys, basically you say, I knew you guys were of bad rapport, and who knows what's going to happen to us. And so I told Sarah to say that she's my sister, and she technically is. But regardless of what the truth behind it or his reasons behind it, he still endangered the entire nation because of that. Now, this is not to say that Abimelech nation was great, um, and that he himself was awesome. That was not what's being said here. Over this specific instance, Abimelech was innocent. he was in, he was innocent. Maybe not in other regards, but in this situation, he was innocent. And so God was not going to allow his own nation be destroyed over something that he did not do. Now, we know from later on that the Philistines were definitely not innocent. They were a really horrible nation and group of people. But again, in this instance, Abimelech had done nothing wrong. And so God gave him a way out, gave him a way to make things right, to do the right thing, and etc. Now, you may see here, I have a question here, collective punishment. Well, there's a reason for that. So, Abimelech, if something would have happened with Sarah, it wouldn't have only been Abimelech's fault. Okay? Because no one else tried to stop Abimelech from doing that. Matter of fact, they probably encouraged it. And so, as a whole, the nation would have suffered because no one attempted to stop what was happening, and because Abimelech was head of the nation. Now, we are all responsible for our own sins. However, the head represents the whole. And so if the head is being disobedient and sinful and doing things, it tends to affect the whole. And so you can see it what happened to Israel. You can see it with uh, with what happened to other nations. You can see where when the king, those rulers kept acting wickedly, and no one in their nations tries to stop them, the whole nation is judged. All right. Okay, so Abimelech goes as far as to make sure that not only does he return Sarah to Abraham safe and unharmed, but also to ensure that no one can say that Sarah did something that was against her reputation. So he makes sure her reputation is unstained. And so what it really says here is that, even pagan people, even the worst of people can have instances of righteous behavior, and even God's people can have instances of misbehavior. Okay, there's no clear line where, all pagans are 100% bad and can't do anything right. Well, that's not the case. It's not true at all. Each of us have a Yetzer Hara, which is a evil inclination, and a Yetzer Hatov, which is a good inclination. Okay, the difference is that when God's people um, do their best to follow God's commands and to allow Him to enhance their good inclination, whereas those who don't follow Him are led about and controlled by their evil inclination in general. Now, one thing I pondered in my mind when I was reading this, because you see twice now, once with Pharaoh and once with Abimelech, you see where Sarah has been pined after. But then you think about it, you're like, well, wait a minute, she's in her 90s. And so you're wondering, like, why are these men so much after her and she's in her 90s? And the only reason it could have been is that Sarah must have still been absolutely beautiful in her 90s. She must not have looked her age, not one iota. She must have been looking like she was still in her 30s, 40s, maybe younger. And so she did not look her age. And so that's why these men were still, pining after her. So um, it's interesting because as we read through all of Abraham and Sarah's narrative, this last parashah and this one, we assume, we're reading about these two old wrinkly people who are, close to their expiration date, and that is not the picture you get here. Not only that, but Abraham just later on, just a minute or two, as we go forward in the parashah, he climbs a mountain, okay, and he's well over 100 years old, okay. So you know, this is not the picture of a frail old man. These are two people that are still in their prime, regardless of their age. They do not look their age. They're both strong. They're both still um, uh, good looking in appearance. I mean, it's totally the opposite of what most of us probably think when we read this. So, anyways, it's just interesting to think about. And it goes to show you how much humanity has declined over succeeding generations. All right. So we also see here that God tells Abimelech to go ahead and ask Abraham to pray for him, since Abraham is a prophet. So Abraham is actually formally called a prophet by God here. Okay, so Abraham is the father of all of Israel. He is a father of many nations, and he is also a prophet. Okay. Now, as a result of that, we see that one job of a prophet is intercession, which Abraham does for Abimelech and his nation. So, and you also see Abraham does it for Sodom and Gomorrah. And so, Abraham, as a prophet, is an intercessor. All right, so we go into chapter 21, and we read about, in the first 7 verses, we read about the birth of Yitzchak. Now, God visits Sarah at the exact time he says he was going to. So it's been about a year after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, because remember, he tells them, I will return to you a year after this time. So he returns after a year and visits Sarah, and she becomes pregnant. And then 9 months later has Yitzchak. Okay? Um, and then he is circumcised per the commandment of God after 8 days. Now, notice that circumcision again here is before the Mosaic covenant. This is something prior to have anything having to do with the Mosaic covenant. This is actually the sign of the covenant made with Abraham to be a part of Abraham's lineage, are a considered part of the lineage and be part of God's people. Is extended into the Mosaic covenant to um, that would continue to happen, so that all those who are born of the stock of Abraham, so to speak, um, receive circumcision. And we talked about, there's other imagery that goes into that, and in the previous Parashah. I encourage you to look at that if you have time. Um, so Sarah laughs with utter joy this time. So it's not a laugh of, yeah, right, or how is this even going to happen? This time it's a laugh of utter joy for what God had done. And so in a way, God gets a last laugh here. Um, there's been a bunch of laughing done about this child. Um, some with lack of understanding, some with maybe lack of faith. And now there's a laugh of joy, and God gets a kind of laugh, saying, "Ha, I told you, I told you." All right. So now we come to a part of the narrative where we start talking. We're back with Ishmael again. Okay. And so every time, um, every time there's been a pregnancy, um, part of the narrative happen, there's been a clash between Sarah and Hagar. The first time it was with Hagar, because Hagar thought she was better than Sarah because she was pregnant and Sarah couldn't get pregnant, and so she felt that she was elevated above Sarah because she was holding the child of promise in her womb. This time it's because of Yishmael making fun of Yitzchak. Okay? And again, Sarah had enough. Apparently, this rift was not healed. It looked like it actually looked like it ripped the sore wide open. And Sarah immediately wants Hagar and Ishmael gone. This will be the second time this has actually happened to Hagar. Um, and so Yishmael, with him making fun and doing things he's doing, he's already starting to fulfill the words of the angel of him being against everyone. He's already stirring up trouble. Um, so again, Sarah once again has Hagar and Ishmael banished, and this time for good. They do not come back this time. Now, Abraham was felt bad, and it says on account of his son. But that's a kind of a generic statement. Why was he feeling bad on account of his son? Part of it, is probably multiple reasons, but I think part of it was guilt. Um, he had to have known, had he and Sarah not taken things into their own hands, this would not be an issue. It would not be an issue at all. But because this has happened, now all this is playing out. And unfortunately, and um, I don't know if Abraham as a prophet kind of foresaw down the road where this was going to lead to more issues between Ishmael and the descendants of Yitzchak or not. Um, and so, we don't know what Abraham as a prophet saw. Maybe he kind of saw that as well. But he definitely felt bad what was happening. It was his son. He didn't want to see bad things happening to his son. He felt bad that he had to send his son away. Notice he didn't think anything about Hagar. There wasn't anything he said about Hagar being sent away. It was only about Ishmael. Um, and so maybe he felt it was not, that all this happened was not Ishmael's fault. And in a way, of course, it kind of was because he made fun of Yitzhak. But anyways, and so again, all those kind of things mixed together was probably what contributed towards the way Abraham was feeling. All right. Um, so then God reiterates his promise about, he kind of comforts Abraham by reiterating his promise to Ishmael that he would become a great nation, that this wasn't the end, that he wasn't going to die out in the wilderness, that things weren't going to turn out bad for Ishmael, that God was still going to bless Ishmael. All right, so we see again they are once again sent into the wilderness of Beersheba. We see once again that she is distraught without hope. It's kind of um, a mirror of what happened in this first account between Hagar and Sarah. So Hagar is so distraught, she puts the child under a bush and try to I guess give him some shade. Um, and then she sits a ways off, doesn't even want to look at what's going to happen to him. That tells you probably how hot it was at the time in that wilderness and dry, and how they were out of water and everything. And so she's expecting, she's expecting the worst to happen. But God demonstrates that He does care about Ishmael. Even though the promise is not Ishmael's, it does not mean that God didn't care about him. Um, and so God cares about all people, um, regardless of what promises are for them or not for them. And so this is the same way here with Ishmael. Now notice again, after the angel talks to them, the angel Adonai, so that's what I was talking about earlier, angel Adonai shows up again, and actually talks in the first person as God. Um, if Hagar finds a well of water, and is able to go ahead and get water for her and for Ishmael. And so at the end of this, we see that Hagar goes to Egypt and gets a wife for Ishmael. So they cement that connection to Egypt. Okay, that's kind of a foreshadowing, because Egypt is the antithesis of God's ways. Egypt is the opposite of God. They are the world. They are the world's ways. They are polytheistic. They are all the things that are not God. And so, um, uh, by Ishmael retrieving a wife from there, um, you know, it doubles down on the fact that he may love Abraham, but at the same time, he's no longer going to completely adhere to Abraham's way of life. And so a clear division happens here, where Ishmael becomes basically Egypt, and Abraham is representative of Israel. And this will play out further on, not just in the Torah and Tanakh at large, but also even now to today. Okay, so we see where Abimelech is now, conversing with Abraham again. They meet up. Abimelech brings a captain of his guard, and so when he brings a captain of his guard, that may have just been for protection. Maybe Abimelech was anticipating some kind of fight, or maybe he just wanted to appear larger in life. There's probably a bunch of different reasons why that was happening. Um, um, but when he did apparently fear Abraham, that's part of the reason why he brought his captain of the guard. So he feared, and it says here, it kind of insinuates here that Abimelech feared Abraham because he was being blessed by God, and it was being enlarged. And it kind of harkens back to what happens later in Exodus, Shemot, when Egypt did the same. They feared how large Israel was becoming, but instead enslaved them instead of making a covenant with them. So apparently what had happened was Abimelech's people and Abraham's people were fighting over water. Okay, now as you know, down in southern Israel, water's kind of scarce. So there were wells you could go to get water, but it wasn't like the water just flow freely. It was where you went down. It was very arid, and there wasn't a lot down there. Now there were what's called wadis and things of that nature, but mostly the water was gotten from wells. Um, so um, So, anyways, we don't know if Abimelech was actually culpable or not. Was he involved in what was happening between them, or was he truly, ignorant of it? We don't know. But regardless, um, Abraham held Abimelech to account because he was their leader. Regardless of what he knew or didn't know, he's the leader. He's responsible, and so Abraham held him to account for it. And so they go ahead and decide to make a covenant together about whose well it was. okay, and to prove that it was Abraham's well. And that way, Abimelech's men will leave him alone and stop causing problems. But it also extended to their relationship where, it would kind of heal over um, what seems to be a long simmering uh, argument between the two peoples. Um, all right, so as I mentioned earlier several times, Abimelech was the king of the Philistines. Abimelech is actually a title. He could have been the first king, so his name could have literally been Abimelech, and then other ones afterwards were just named Abimelech as a title because of him to be king of the Philistines. For whatever reason, he was a king of the Philistines, and so this is a first overall through this whole entire thing between Abraham and Abimelech over the past several chapters. This has been the first encounter between Abraham and the people and the Philistines. So the Philistines are already here. They are occupying a section of the Mediterranean coast. There are thoughts about where the Philistines came from. A lot of people think they come from the Isle of Kaftor, which is actually south of Greece, and so they're descendants of the Grecians, but we don't know that for sure. Okay, so Abraham, as he likes to do, plants a marker to remember what God has done for him. So Abraham is very much, when something special happens, I memorialize it. I put a memorial here because I want to remember what he did. So, and it's not just for him. I'm sure he's probably thinking, hey, so every one of my people, all my descendants will remember what God had done. Okay, so it was an act of worship. And then for a while, afterwards, Abraham dwells in um, Philistine. Okay, he dwells in Philistine for a while, um, and which was why it was so important for him to have that covenant with Abimelech. All right, so now we're at another very well-known part of this parashah, the binding of Yitzchak. Okay, so that at the very gate, we learn that God is going to test Abraham. Now, we don't like the sound of that. We think that's cruel. How could God test him? How could God purposely set things up or do things to test us? Does he want us to fall? Does he want us to fail? Does he enjoy this? Is he a sadist? No, it's none of those things. What it is that God does it for our own good. It's just to get us to grow. Okay, it's to prove our growth. Okay, and so God's always looking for opportunities to grow us and make us better. Okay, because and it's a lifelong process for all of us because of our fallen nature. All right, so God calls to Abraham, and his response is Hineni, okay, which literally means behold. It's kind of like an action form of here I am, like almost like I'm ready. Here I am, God, I'm ready. What do you want to say? What do you want me to do? Okay, he's ready for service. Okay, and so God commands Abraham to offer Isaac or Yitzhak as a whole burnt offering on Mount Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah is what is currently Mount Zion, or where Jerusalem is located. Okay, so we're talking about that that Abraham is about ready to offer Yitzhak on the very place where the temple stood, probably in the very place where the altar would have been. Um, or maybe even a place where it would have been the future Holy of Holies. We don't know, but it was definitely around that area. And so there is a lot of imagery there, a lot of things you could unpack. And I'm going to actually get to that here in a while once I get to the end of this Parashah study. And so after being told what to do, Abraham prepares for the journey and sacrifice. And on the third day, the sacrifice was made. Now, those two are key bullet points there. I'm going to get to them later on. So Hanani is used by Abraham again whenever he's asked by Yitzchak about what's going on with the sacrifice. So if you're Yitzhak, you're probably looking and say, okay, there's wood here, there's a knife, there's rope, we have everything we need, but we're still walking up here, and there's no sacrifice. Where's the lamb? Where was the sacrifice? Um, it's the text seems to insinuate that maybe Yitzchak is starting to understand or get the hint that maybe I'm the sacrifice. Okay, you can imagine what's going through Yitzchak's mind when thinking about the possibility that he is going to be the sacrifice. Okay, however, Abraham assures him that God will provide a lamb. Okay, God will provide a lamb. Okay. All right. So when they arrive, Abraham does exactly what he was told to do. He puts Isaac up on an altar. He bound up and on top of the wood, and he is ready to go ahead and just go through with it and plunge the knife. Um, now, what's interesting is the text does not seem to indicate that Yitzchak tried to resist. There was no, hey, you're not sacrificing me, or any of that kind of stuff. He just went up there and did it without any resistance. Um, there was a lot of trust there, trust of his father, trust of God. There was a lot of trust that was being displayed by Yitzchak. Okay, so if you get the picture here, Abraham's ready to plunge the knife into Yitzchak. I mean, we're seconds away, and as he's bringing the knife up to do so, the angel Adonai has to call Abraham twice to get him to stop. Okay, so that's how committed Abraham was to obeying God. He was ready to go through it no matter what, and the angel Adonai had to call to him twice to get him to stop. Okay, and so uh, a ram was provided. Um, it was not a lamb. Now that's a key thing to recognize here. There was a ram provided, but it was not a lamb. Okay, but there is a lamb that comes later, and I'll talk about this here in a bit. All right, so um, now rams in later in the Torah um, are offered because of fraud against one's neighbor. Okay, so it kind of brings to picture the part that whenever we sin, we are committing fraud against God. Okay, so and not only that, so we also know that Yitzchak is Abraham's firstborn. So uh, if you read later in Torah, that all the firstborn had to be redeemed, because all the firstborn, regardless of animal, human, or whatever happens to be, they're all God's. Okay, so it's almost like at the same time that this ram was also being used to redeem Yitzhak, um, um, for him not being that sacrifice or being offered to God in that way. All right, so this act alone, and what God makes it very clear here, this act spurs God to reiterate his past promise. And he states specifically because it is of this act. Okay? Now, there have been a lot of things that Abraham had done that were obedient, and and God had reiterated his promises several times throughout this Parashah and the last one. But this act alone, though, God says, causes him to reiterate his promises and double down on doing what he was going to do for God. Not only that, it says in the text that God swore by himself. Well, he doesn't get any. It does. Once God swears by himself, it cannot be undone. It is a rock solid promise. Now, why was it this act? Well, here's the thing. Abraham was willing to give up his only son, to God. Okay. Now, because he was willing to do that, God was basically saying because of this, I'm going to go ahead and bring Messiah through you who will do the same. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So anyways, to end our parashah, Abraham then receives news from his relatives in Aram about his brother Nahor having sons. Now, it may seem like, okay, well, who cares? Why include this? Well, because this will play into future narratives with Yitzhak and also with Yaakov. Okay, so what happened up in Aram was important because um, Avram's descendants, his sons, were about to, Yitzchak and Yaakov were about to interact with Nahor's descendants again. Now, it must have been a really long time between communication between Abraham and his relatives, because it talks about all the sons that Nahor had. Well, I mean, if you think about it, that was, it had to have occurred over years and years and years. And so um, it must have been quite a long time between when they last communicate with each other. Now, this could have been because of distance. It could have been because Nahor just couldn't, they couldn't locate Abraham because he was wandering about. Even though Abraham did stay in some places for a little while. Or maybe it was just some animosity between him and his relatives because of his decision to leave the family. That was not a decision made lightly, by the way. So him leaving could have been construed as, offensive. So, okay. So we're at the end of the Parashah. And so I kind of wanted to go back over a few things with regard to Messiah. So, and if you look in the Bari Hadashah, you start to see some parallels between what happened to Yeshua, Jesus, and what happened with Yitzhak. Okay, so let's go back and look at a couple of these. All right, so Abraham prepared for the journey and sacrifice, and on the third day, the sacrifice they made. So if you look in of what Yeshua says, he talks a lot about the 3 days, the third day. So his whole entire life, Yeshua prepared for himself to be sacrificed. And on the third day, he actually was sacrificed. And on the third day again, he was raised again. Otherwise, the sacrifice, it would have solved one part of what God promised, but it would not have adhered to the promise he made to David for a king to eternally be upon his throne. All right. So we also see here that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son, okay, to God. Because of that, God used the descendant of David, Yeshua, his only son that came through the Virgin Mary, to be sacrificed for all of mankind. Okay, and so God's promised to Abraham that in him would all the nations be blessed. Well, that's what happened. Messiah came from Abraham, and he, just like Abraham, laid up Yitzchak on the altar to sacrifice to God. God gave his only son, his only unique son. We are all children of God. Obviously, we all are, descended from Adam, and Adam was, created by God and breathed in life by God. But Yeshua was unique in that he was divinely. He came about divinely because of God's Spirit actually making Miriam pregnant without the need for any husband. So we see here that a lot of what happened in with Abraham foreshadowed um, events of the future, including what would happen with Messiah. Um, Now, there are all kind of different ways to explain away everything I've just said, and you can feel free to do that. Um, there's all kind of ways to explain it all away, shove it away, and just say, nope, not going to believe it, not going to listen to it. It's just another bunch of um, babble by people who don't know anything. Okay, I know the teachings that are out there. I know how Yeshua is viewed by different people groups. Um, But I'm telling you that all the events, a lot of the events in Abraham's life, a lot of the things that he did were prophetic. They were foreshadows of what would happen later, including especially this incident with the binding of Yitzhak. Um, that it foreshadowed what God would do with his only unique son um, to um, bring forgiveness to all of us. Now, again, why would God need to do that? We see in here that there was a ram, and so God, Abraham offered the ram, and that was it. Um, and we see later in Torah that God prescribed sacrifices to deal with the sin issue, both for sins of ignorance and sins of um, other natures. But the thing is that this was never meant to be a permanent thing. It was never meant to be where we would continually for eternity sacrifice animals um, so that we could be forgiven of our sin. Um, God's whole point was to return creation back to its pre-fall status. Well, before the fall, there was no sin. Well, if we have to keep offering sacrifices to get rid of that sin, that is not restoring back to the pre-fall status. It's not. In addition, you cannot cancel out imperfection with more imperfection. Okay, you're not going to be able to cancel out sin with the imperfect blood of animals. Okay, so what were the sacrifices there for then? They were there as an object lesson and an object of worship. It was to teach the children of Israel what sin cost and what has to be done to get rid of sin. It is a bloody matter, and if you remember back several chapters in way back in Genesis and Bereshit, it talks about that only by the blood is sin canceled out. Okay. So we automatically know that blood has to be applied to cancel out sin. But if the imperfect blood of animals can't atone for sin permanently, where it has to be done all the time, then obviously those sacrifices are not effective, not permanently. And so God had to bring something about to permanently deal with the sin issue, and that is where Messiah Yeshua comes in. Okay. Um, you can read it in Isaiah 53. It's in all several different chapters in Isaiah, um, where it talks about that the Messiah would die for all of Israel, and will go ahead and take our place, and will receive our punishment for our sins. If you remember back last Parashah, when God cuts the covenant with Abraham, he actually he becomes the guarantor of it. Okay, so anything that happens, he he both he will receive the negative consequences of the covenant violation. Now, like we talked about back then, there's still a small cut represented by the circumcision. There's a small cut in comparison to us when we break the covenant. But God had already planned to take on the brunt of that himself, and that happened in the person of Messiah Yeshua. Okay, and so we're seeing already throughout Bereshit, throughout Genesis, um, foreshadowings of what Messiah would do. And I encourage you to search it out yourself. You don't have to believe me. You don't take my word for it. Um, I encourage you to search it out for yourself. Um, and I encourage you also um, to ask God to show you the truth. And I ask you also to, not just read the word for yourself. Don't don't read commentaries. Don't read from what other people think, because there are a lot of other people out there who are firmly entrenched who will not, under any circumstance, believe that Yeshua is Messiah. And so reading their work is going to be a fruitless endeavor. It's not going to do anything for you. Um, you need to read it for yourself. You need to read the Parashah or the New Testament for yourself. You need to read all this for yourself and learn for yourself, um, and see that Yeshua is exactly who he says he is. So again, I really encourage you to do that. That's all I can do. There's not a thing I can do to convince you of Yeshua's messiahship. I can't. Um, there is it's way it's I wouldn't say too easy, but there are so many ways to go ahead and just downplay it, um, to uh, um, to go against it, to explain it away, and there's always going to be that. It doesn't matter. I mean, what concrete evidence anybody shows you anything? I mean, look nowadays. Look nowadays with all the misinformation out there. It doesn't matter what cold hard facts somebody shows you. Um, you can still always find a way to not believe, and that's kind of how things are with when it comes to Yeshua. You're always going to always have a way to not believe, always. And so you need to actually ask God's Spirit to show you the truth. All right. So that is all I have for today. Um, if you need prayer, please feel free to go ahead and send your prayer requests to the email address on the screen there. Um, Again, please keep it anonymous. You can give me first names. You can give me, generalities about what you want being prayed for, but please don't give me specifics. I don't need to know those as far as any kind of personal identifiable information or anything of that nature. Just a first name, who I'm praying for, and some general details is sufficient. All right. Well, brachot to each of you, and shalom, and I hope to see you next time.